Hi everybody, welcome back to the 51 Yarns spin along. This week is week 14, which is fine wool. And although it doesn't specifically say fine yarn, that's kind of the route that I'm going to go down. If you're new to this channel, then welcome. My name is Bex. I have a podcast on this channel, which I do every so often. Kind of should have done a recent episode, but haven't. But I also do a weekly video which is designed to coincide with Ply Magazine's 51 Yarns to Spin Before You Cast Off challenge, which they're running on Instagram, Facebook and Ravelry. It ties in with their book, 51 Yarns, and basically the idea is that each week there's a different topic. Everybody spins along to that topic, and if you post a photo on Facebook, Instagram or Ravelry with the correct hashtags, which are in the description below, then you have the chance to win a year's subscription to Ply Magazine, which is very cool. I'm not sponsored by Ply Magazine or affiliated with them in any way, shape or form. I just find it a really useful resource. There is my disclaimer. This week is fine wool, and I had a little look through my stash of bits of fleece. A few years ago, I put the word out on the UK Spinners Forum on Ravelry and asked if people could spare any little bits of fleece for me to just have a go at and sample with and look at how fibre prep worked and all that kind of stuff. So they did send me some stuff, and I picked out two things this week that kind of fit into the fine wool category. One was Cormo and the other one was Rambouillet. So those are both merino derivative sheep, and as such it means that generally the characteristics are very, very small crimp, teeny tiny crimp, and very densely packed on the animal. So when you see these Cormo tips, you will understand a little bit more about that. I looked at both of them, and the one that I felt was most like the standard qualities of a fine wool was the Cormo. So that's the one that I'm going to be working with today. I've already washed some, but I wanted to show you that process. So I'm going to grab some Cormo here. I always leave a lock as a kind of reference, but just to show you, this is what it looks like. So you can kind of see even from this that it's been very densely packed on the animal, so it's grown very, very straight. And also you can probably see that it's really only the tips, the very, very tips, that are particularly dirty. That dirt doesn't get very far into the fibre because it is so densely packed on the animal that the dirt just kind of sits on the top. The Rambouillet was a little bit more all over the place. I'll just give you a bit of a comparison. You'll probably see why I chose to use the Cormo. This was the Rambouillet. And I can still see areas where there are, you know, proper locks, but it's just not anywhere near as neat as the Cormo was. Before we go too much further in this episode, there are a couple of resources that I'm going to recommend. First one is Ply Magazine does have a fine issue, which was the summer 2015 issue. You should still be able to get physical back copies, but you can also get digital ones as well. Very, very, very useful, as is the case with all Ply magazines. Oh, Dexter, what's the matter? What's the matter? Oh my goodness. What is it? What's the matter? Come here. Come on, have a little cuddle with me. Have a little cuddle with me, shall we? Hey, what do you think? What do you think, Dexter? No. So that's one resource. The other resource is the interweave video by Margaret Stove, which is called Spinning for Lace. And that is an amazing resource. If you've not come across Margaret Stove before, she is a New Zealand spinner who's lacework is amazing. She just has a really, really, really intimate knowledge of merino and spinning fine fibres, and yeah, she's just awesome, and that's a great resource. I would highly recommend that. If you're new to Tweed videos, they do downloadable copies, which is what I have of the videos that I've purchased, and quite often they have sales. So if there's something that you want, but maybe money's a little bit of an issue, just hang on, there will be a sale at some point and you'll be able to get a reduced cost. Okay, so I think that's enough of a preamble. Let's get on with washing some fleece. Okay, so I'm going to demonstrate this using the lock by lock method, or one of the lock by lock methods that Margaret Stove uses, which is basically 2 containers of really hot water with a lot of detergent and just dipping the locks in one by one. She also does a method where she wets the lock and then rubs it really hard on soap, but I don't generally have any bar soap in the house, so I didn't really have that facility. So I've literally just boiled this kettle. Just going to pop some water in each of these. Then I'm going to put a little bit of cold water into each of these, because you don't want the water to be boiling, you just want it to be hot. And then into this one, which is going to be my wash jug, I'm going to put a fair amount of detergent. It should be slippery, the water should be slippery. So if I put my fingers in there, it is really quite hot. So I'm going to just pop a little bit more cold water in. And I'm trying to keep these two roughly the same temperature, because this one will be my wash, this will be my rinse. I want them to be round about the same temperature. So if I put my fingers in there, I can just about put my fingers in for a second or so, and the water feels really slippery. And that's exactly what you want. All I need to do is just take a lock. I'm going to grab it at the cut end, and I'm going to put the first 2/3 into the water. And you can see there that because it's the right temperature, it just instantly kind of sunk in. So I've just swished it around a couple of times, and then I can lift it out. And at this point, you can give it a little squeeze, get some of the excess water out, flip it around, and then do exactly the same with the cut end. Little bit of a swish, and then just a little bit of a squeeze to squeeze the water out. Then we do exactly the same in the rinse bath. Again, bit of a squeeze, and then that can just go onto a cloth or a towel. So I've now finished washing all of the locks that I need for the moment, and I've got them on a tea towel here. I'm just going to roll them up. And then I can give them a good old squeeze. And that should get them fairly dry. And then I would just leave them flat to continue drying out naturally. It doesn't take very long. I think the ones that I did yesterday, I left for probably about 2 or 3 hours, and they were completely dry. And when it's dried out, you're going to get your lock going from this to this. Isn't that amazing? It's got so much cleaner at this end. You've just got some little tiny dark tips, which we're actually going to pick off before we spin. But the whole thing is just beautifully clean and white and soft. So that's that first bit done. So we've separated the locks and we've washed them all. I think this method works really well for sampling lace, or if you are working on a really special project. You don't necessarily have to wash every fleece like this, because with some of them you could be there for a very long time. However, I think there are things that work really well about this method that you can apply to any other method of preparing or washing fleece. The first thing is that because we're washing one lock at a time, there is plenty of space for that lock to spread out and for the detergent and the water to really get into the fibres of that particular staple. If you put too much in, if I were to try and grab an entire handful and do that in the water, it's not going to get in between all the different fibres, so it's not going to get the fleece as clean, and that's why lock by lock is really successful. So if you are washing larger quantities of fleece, just try to make sure that you're not packing it in too tightly, because otherwise you're going to be disappointed with the results. The other thing is the temperature of the water. So if you actually want to degrease your fleece, something in that. If you want to completely get the lanolin out of your fleece, you need it to be at least above 60 degrees centigrade. Otherwise it's not going to melt the lanolin off. And I think that thing about not packing too much in would be even more important in pretty much any other kind of fleece. Because in merino, the tips are really sort of tight and the fleece is very tightly packed, there isn't actually very much dirt in the fleece. The dirt is really only at the tip end, but there is quite a lot of lanolin. I think if you think about any other kind of fleece where there's a lot more dirt in it, you're going to need even more space for the water and the detergent to really get in there and clean it. It also shows the importance of trying to keep the temperature the same across the wash and the rinse. If your water cools down too much, you might have to either start again or just top it up with a bit more boiling water. In the interweave video, Margaret Stove also shows a technique where she uses those kind of plastic mesh tubes, I guess you would describe them as, that you sometimes find things like onions and that kind of thing packaged in. She uses those and she basically takes a staple at a time, feeds them into these bags, but really only has one layer happening at one time. So she hasn't got very much fleece in there, but she's able to do a batch at a time. And if you're trying to work with a similar type of fleece, but on a larger scale, rather than lock by lock, you could do it that method as well. Check out that interweave video that I mentioned earlier for more information on that. If I'm washing other types of fleece, quite often, personally, I will do it in my salad spinner. It's a reasonable size for maybe a handful or so of fibre. I wouldn't do too much fleece in one go because I would want room for it to be able to spread out. I've also seen people washing them in the bath and all sorts of stuff. I don't really fancy cleaning the grease off the bath. That's the only problem. And of course the other method of cleaning fleece is something called a swint bath. Basically this is fermenting your fleece clean. Only try this if you live in the countryside with not too many people around you, because the smell of it apparently is horrific. But there you go, lock by lock is one method of washing fleece ready for spinning. Okay, so now onto the actual spinning of this very fine single. There are a few modifications that I wanted to talk about because I think one of the things that people find quite difficult about spinning fine wools and spinning them as lace is that it does take a little bit of modification to your wheel to be able to get it to go really, really fine, but without the tension of the wheel being too much. You can get around that by using something like a support spindle, but I've tried using support spindles and there's something about the coordination required that just doesn't agree with my body. So my hands can't keep up, which is kind of frustrating. I'm sure if I practiced enough, I would probably get the hang of it, but I find them quite tricky. But there are some modifications that you can make if you're spinning with a spinning wheel that will allow you to spin fine yarns. You might just kind of need to play around with it a little bit. I'm going to be using the Shat Matchless for this one because I feel like it's kind of closest to what most people have. and because I want to make some adjustments and show you what you can do with your wheel that will help you to spin fine yarns without the tension on the wheel being too much. Personally, if I'm spinning a very fine yarn, I prefer to use double drive rather than Scotch tension, because I just feel like sometimes Scotch tension can behave a little bit unpredictably and you'll get a kind of a grabbing of the yarn, and that's not really what I want. So I'm on double drive. I'm also using the super high speed whirl and the high speed bobbin. So that's putting twist in very quickly. Sometimes though, that's not going to be enough and you might need to make some other modifications to your wheel to get that fine yarn, but without the tension just pulling it and breaking it all the time. So I've made a couple of adjustments. One of them is cross-lacing the flyer. So cross-lacing just means that instead of my yarn going straight up the side of the flyer, I'm just making it go across and then back across. And you can do that multiple times if you want. I can definitely tell the difference if I take this off to do a Plyback test and then forget to put it back cross-laced. There's been a couple of times when I've been like, whoa, why is it pulling so much? And then I've realised what's happened. So cross-lacing the flyer is definitely a great idea. And that can be a really easy way to prevent too much tension. The other thing that you could do is to fit some pipe insulation to the middle of your bobbin. You'll find that as you're spinning, particularly with Scotch tension, as you're spinning you need to adjust the tension once you get the bobbin part way full. If you put some well-fitting pipe insulation in this section of the bobbin, kind of wrapped around the core, then you won't find that you need to make that adjustment, and it'll be easier to get a good light tension. Other thing you can look at is your drive band materials. I always think about drive bands as kind of being proportional to the yarn that you're spinning. So if you're spinning quite a fine yarn, you might want to try switching to a finer drive bands. In this instance, I haven't had to do that, but I have done it before. I've done things like splitting a commercial string down into small segments, so just like undoing the plies and using 2 or 3 plies from that yarn. So if cross-lacing your flyer or adding pipe insulation hasn't worked, maybe have a look at your drive bands and change the drive band material. Ideally, you should be able to treadle away and not really feel any draw-in. It should be up to you when the yarn's going to go into the orifice. So once you feel that you've set your spinning wheel up with an appropriate amount of draw-in, the next thing is going to be to take one of your locks that you washed earlier, and what you'll probably find is that the dirty tips will still be on there. So all you need to do with those is just pinch them off. They'll normally come off fairly easily. And at the same time, you can be just trying to open up the lock a little bit. I like to leave the cut end together so that there's a little bit of resistance. There's something to sort of pull back against. But you may have your own preference. Give it a try and see what you feel. So if I now start spinning this, I'm just going to have a couple of fibres catch on. And then I've been using a short backward draw. The reason that I'm using a short backward draw for this is that Margaret Stove points out a very good point actually, which is that a lot of times we're tempted, if we're doing short forward draw, to essentially not have staple lengths overlapping. And in something that's this fine, you really need some overlap. Otherwise your yarn's just going to fall to pieces. So I'm doing pinch, pull back, but I'm also just trying to attenuate the crimp. I don't want to stretch it, but I do want to straighten the crimp out as the twist goes in. I was actually experimenting with this a moment ago, and I found that if I treated my finger like a corner that it has to go round, that was actually a really successful option for me as well. So give it a try, see what you think. You'll find what the best way of working is for you. One of the other things that can happen when you're spinning lace is that it snaps. Because it's a very, very fine yarn, and because we're putting quite a lot of twist in it, if we put too much in or not enough in, then at some point it's going to break. The major problem is if you have pretty much filled your bobbin and it breaks, if it's under high tension, it ends up burying the end inside all the other yarn on the bobbin, and it's a bit of a nightmare to get out. So there are a couple of things that you can do. The first thing is, as soon as you feel it snap, just let the treadles go. Just take your feet off the treadles. Or if you're on an electric spinner, instead of pressing the foot pedal, which would stop it almost instantly, I would actually turn the speed dial down very gradually. By doing that, you're taking the tension off, and so hopefully the end will just float on top of the rest of the yarn, rather than burying itself inside the remainder of the bobbin. As usual, as I go along, I'm just doing a little plyback test. So I'm just taking yarn off the bobbin rather than what's waiting to go into the orifice, because you just can't really judge whether it's got enough twist if it hasn't actually fed onto the bobbin yet. There's probably quite a significant difference between something that's sitting outside the orifice and something that's already on the bobbin. And there we go, that is my little plyback test. I'm actually really happy with that. That's very cool. There's a nice amount of spring in it. It's also very strong. Yeah, pretty impressed with myself on that one, have to say. It's taken probably an hour or so of just kind of messing around with some settings on the wheel and trying to figure out what the best sort of hand position was and the best tensioning system. But I'm really happy with that little sample. So I'm going to tie that off. I'll put that in my sample book later on. So I have spun a little bit of singles and I'm very happy with my plyback test. It's going to take me a while to finish the rest of it, and obviously what I washed this morning hasn't dried yet. So I'm not going to be able to show you plying in this video, but a couple of things to think about. First thing is that you want to try and have as little tension on the yarn as possible when you're plying. If at all possible, the best type of lazy Kate for it would be a horizontal one with no kind of tensioning or braking system. If you don't have that, then you could improvise. Like I mentioned last week, you can just get a shoebox, get some knitting needles, poke them through and put the bobbin in the middle. If you are going to do that, just make sure that the knitting needles are small enough to very easily fit through, so there's very little friction on the inside of the bobbin. Margaret Stove has some amazing tips in that interweave video, and I think that's really all I want to say, because honestly, that video, if you're interested in spinning for lace, that video is amazing. Go and have a look. It's not just, the thing I really like about it is that it's not just you should do this, but she has examples of this is why you should do this and this is what happens if you don't do this, which I find really useful. I would love to have more of that in these videos, but I don't have enough kind of samples floating around to be able to do that kind of stuff. So yeah, go and have a look at the Margaret Stove video on interweave if you possibly can. There is a little clip of it on YouTube, which looks at the sort of attenuation that she does while she's spinning, so you can see another variation on it from mine. Like I said, when I tried doing that tensioning, I found it easiest to have my finger acting like a corner that my fibre has to go round. She uses, she uses her finger underneath it to just provide a little bit of tension to straighten out the crimp. But she has a really good example in that video of why you need to straighten out the crimp. Very interesting, very interesting. So that is pretty much it for this episode of 51 Yarns. I hope it's been useful for you. I do have a couple of other things that I want to talk about. First thing is Tour de Fleece is coming up. It starts on, I want to say the 7th of July. Let me have a quick look. Pretty sure it's the 7th. Yep, 7th of July, so Saturday is when Tour de Fleece kicks off. If you haven't come across Tour de Fleece yet, it's an annual event where spinners around the world in teams spin every day that the Tour de France rides. So when the Tour de France rests, we have a rest day. There's also different challenges. So on like hill days, if it's an extreme climb day for the Tour de France, then there's an extra challenge on the Tour de Fleece. It's just kind of a fun spinning community event, so I would encourage you to get involved if you can. If you pop onto the Ravelry forums for any spinning related thing that you're interested in, you'll probably find that there's a sticky topic at the top of their forum list for sign-ups for their Tour de Fleece team. So have a little look at that. Obviously, the spinning that I do for 51 Yarns is a massive part of the spinning that I do every week, but I might try to have a sweater spin as a target, maybe. I've also got the Gloamintide Mystery Knit-along, the Isolde Mystery Knit-along going on, which kind of also takes up a fair amount of time. So we'll see how much time I actually have in July, because I have a long list of stuff that I need to do. One final thing that I just wanted to mention is you may or may not have noticed that I have switched YouTube adverts back on this channel. So it means that before each video you'll see an advert. I did have adverts on before, but due to some YouTube policy changes, it got taken away in March. And they set new guidelines that everybody had to hit like 1,000 subscribers and 4,000 hours worth of viewing within a year. And I've now done that. It took another month or so for them to review my account, but the option's now back. I wanted to explain why I'm doing that, because I don't want anybody to think that I'm somehow making enormous amounts of money out of this. Firstly, I'm not. Secondly, I have no desire to make oodles and oodles of cash out of it. And thirdly, if I did want to make any money, I would make makeup videos or something that's a bit more commercial than spinning, because let's face it, it's quite niche. The only reason that I have monetization switched on is so that this channel can be a little bit more self-sustaining. Whilst I am totally happy, if necessary, to fund the channel myself, and I have done up until this point, it would be really nice if I had a little pot of money that was entirely dedicated to this channel. For example, every single time I shoot an episode, I have to find somewhere to store probably about 40 gigabytes worth of data. And that's all stored on an external hard drive. It gets transferred temporarily to my computer so that I can work on it more quickly. Then it gets transferred back onto the external hard drive, and that becomes an archive that contains literally everything I have ever shot for Tiny Fibre Studio. That hard drive is currently running out of space, so I know perfectly well that in order to edit this video, I am going to have to get rid of some other stuff that's stored on that hard drive. But it would be really nice if I had a little pot of money that I could just go, oh, I need a new hard drive. There's that pot of money that's entirely made by Tiny Fibre Studio and will be used by the channel, and I'd just be able to go out and buy another hard drive without going into my own pocket. Like I say, I'm totally happy to do that if necessary, but it would just be nice. So that is the only reason that it's there. This is a not-for-profit channel. I don't have any desire to make any money out of it, and I just wanted to clarify that. So yeah, hopefully you understand why I've switched those back on. So I hope this video was useful for you. It's definitely been a really interesting experience for me, spinning fine wools from fleece, which I haven't really done before. And I will see you again next week, which I believe is Tweed week, and I've got something interesting planned for that. So I will see you again then. See you next week.